Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Hello everyone, my name is Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we are going to look at this important issue of should Christians vote in 2024? Now we all know this is election season, and there's all of the hype, and there's the media push, and people are talking about it on Facebook and in your church and in the coffee shop and in the barber shop and everywhere around. But one key thing that I've noticed is that every few years you get these people who are typically Christians that say, I don't know if I'm going to vote this year. I think that I'm above such things in the fray of yada, yada, yada. And we've heard this over and over and over again. What I want to do today is that I'm not going to bind your conscience and say you have to vote, but I'm going to encourage you and say that you should vote in 2024, especially if you are a Christian. Now, before we get into this, I just want to look at a few sort of interesting things that typically go on around this. And it's really interesting. I was recently listening to this podcast, and none of you listen to this podcast. At least I don't know if you listen to this podcast. It's going to kind of show my history a little bit. It's called Farm Life. Like, I grew up in Iowa. I grew up around farms. I care about the agricultural industry. And this very common sense farmer was sitting there, and he raised this question. He goes, do you really think that the undecided voter really exists? And you know what I'm talking about. When you look at the voting things, they talk about, you got the Trump camp and you got the Kamala camp and you got the libertarian camp. But then you always get this little segment of the pie graph that's the undecided person. And I'll be absolutely honest, I really have never ran into this creature. In fact, you might have a greater chance of running into Bigfoot out in the fields of Iowa than you will this undecided voter. And what's really interesting about this election is that I find that there are really no undecided people out there. Like, the issues are clear. People know what's going on. They know the lay of the land. And for the most part, people have made up their minds on who they're going to vote for or who they would vote for if they actually go and vote. And now what's interesting is that we know the typical responses from people. We understand it is our Christian civic duty, it is the duty of all people to vote. So of course you should go and vote. Or you get the other side of, I call this the hyper spiritual Gnostic third way Christian approach, where I can't vote for either of the two candidates. So I come up with my nebulous third party vote in which they write in their neighbor Fred or something like that. We've all seen that. Or you see people who say things like, it would be so utterly wrong for a Christian to vote. Look at the candidates that we have. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's like my daddy. Nobody's like Jesus. Nobody would be voted in as the pastor of my church. Both are abominable apostates. And how could you ever do such a thing? Now, we get all of these different cliche responses to this, and we recognize that so many of them just fall flat on their face. Like the whole hybrid special Christian, I'm going to vote for somebody in the middle idea. Well, first of all, I can guarantee you that candidate is not as pure as the one that you think that you're voting for. Because when you get into the sort of the murk of who these politicians are, and believe me, I used to work in public policy. None of them are angels, my friends. None of them. Not a single last one of them are angels. And the reality is that there's also this aspect of wisdom in the way that you vote. And a vote for a third party is typically a vote for no party. Or the reality is that a vote for the third party is typically a vote for the Democratic Party, unfortunately. And people don't like hearing that. It's the math, it's the history, it's the reality of it. And the other thing is this whole idea of, and it's typically never in reference to the Democrats, because unfortunately we're dealing with sort of the mushy evangelical type who don't actually deal with these. It's usually the never Trumpers out there. Guess what? Trump's not being voted in as your pastor. You've had 40 years of what he's going to be like. And on all the key issues, guess what? He's done a lot more good for society when it comes to the the civic governing of things than most of your mushy 2020 lockdown, third way, George Floyd, all the rest kind of pastors did out there. Believe me, we're beyond that time frame right here. So all of these typical things, I'll tell you exactly where I land on this. I'm on the, you know what, I'm not going to bind your conscience, but you as a Christian, you have the civic duty to vote. You live in both the kingdom of God and in the kingdom of man. And your responsibility is to serve the kingdom of man well. And you do that by voting, by keeping your voice in there, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to deal with one objection, because I can see this thing being sliced and diced and people copying a little section out of here and putting it on the internet. And they're going to say, well, Bill, this makes you a Christian nationalist. You are a Christian and you want to see the good of your religion in this nation. And I go, no, that does not make me a Christian nationalist. I can be a Christian who loves my nation and who represents this idea that all truth is God's truth and all morality is God's morality, and I can vote my principles. But it is false to say that I'm a Christian nationalist. Here's why, guys. When you read the literature, it's not the, oh, you're a Christian and you love your nation, so therefore you're a Christian nationalist. Or, you know what? You like justice, right? And you like it to be applied socially, so therefore you like social justice. We realize that these movements are not just what the bare words say that they are. It's not just, I want to see God's morality legislated out there. Christian nationalism, as represented by figures such as Stephen Wolfe and the whole gang of them, is not just this idea of we want to have biblical morality or drag queen story hour. It's this whole idea of sacralism and neo-integralism, which is the idea of the merging of the church and the state, in which the state enforces not just, quote, the morality of the church, but the theological expressions of the church. The position that I argue for and that I have always argued for is the case of significant Christian influence upon our in society. I'm all in favor of legislating morality because all legislation legislates morality. I am against legislating the particulars of Christianity in such a way that the state will enforce the doctrinal distinctions of a religion to the demise of its citizens, like national blasphemy laws or the imprisoning of people for being atheists, or things like what we found in Europe with Fritz Erba being, put in prison for being a Baptist, or Mary Dyer up in, the Massachusetts, Boston area. And she was a Quaker and she was killed. She was actually hung for being a Quaker. So look to what I have to say here. I am not a Christian nationalist because I'm not a neo-integralist. I'm not a Christian nationalist because I'm not a sacralist. And if you want way more information about my views on that, go to my talk on sovereign nations, in which I lay out the whole case for why I am not a Christian nationalist. Now, that said, here's one of the things that I want us to look at. Should a Christian vote in 2024? Well, first and foremost, I think Christians have the moral responsibility and the moral duty to participate insofar as they can in the government God has given them. So we recognize this, is that, we should participate in the government that we have because we actually can participate in the government that we can. And people always make this whole issue out of, what is the proper role of Christians in doing these types of things? And should Christians participate? And I go, well, it's simple as this. If you have a government that allows you to participate, you should participate. And it's interesting because you look on a map and you look on the map of North Korea and South Korea, a free nation and a communist nation. And you know what? I can guarantee you the people in North Korea would love for things to change. There's a reason the lights are off at night when you look at that map at night. They have no freedom. But we here recognize that we live in a country much, much more like South Korea. In the United States, we have a government that is a democracy that allows us as the people to have our voice heard. And if you have the opportunity to have your voice be heard, you should do something about it. Now, I want to deal with this whole issue of God has instituted all governments. And yes, this is not to say that all governments are the best model of governing, but it is to say this, that when a government is established in the grand providence of God, there are no maverick molecules. Nothing comes into this world apart from the sovereign decree of God. This includes both the good and the bad, because you know what? Some are for blessing and some are for judgment. And what we have to find is that when we look even throughout the text of scripture, you have a government of Pharaoh, you have a government of Caesar, you have a government of a king, you have a good king, you have a bad king. But as we look just throughout the flow of human history, we also find that you can have good democracies, bad democracies, good republics, bad republics, and all the rest. The point is that I do think that there is a better form of government. I could never deny that. And I will get into that here in just a second. But my point is that when I say Christians have the moral duty to participate insofar as they can in the government God has given us, well, guess what? You don't have as much participation when the king just comes out and goes up or down. Sorry, you don't have that much ability to participate in that form of a government, but you do in our form of government. So that whole issue of, in such and such a time, no, where do you live now? What's the context in which you find yourself? How should you operate in that particular place? Now, in my opinion, and I think good reasoning and good exegesis could back this up, in our place in world history, this representative republic is the best form of government that we have. Now, obviously, the idea of the philosopher king or Jesus ruling from Jerusalem is ultimately going to be God's great, providential salvation ending form of government. But we're not there yet. And you know what? The people that we have are not Jesus Christ reigning from the throne. And what we have found is that given all of the significant errors of dictators, both religious and non-religious, and the effects of that we have had, there's a true sense in which we, the people, gives a voice to the people and protects the lives of the people and protects the world in which we live. Now, here's what I mean by this. This concept of we, the people, gives a voice of the people. But in doing so, it can also counterbalance the we, the people with, quote, Johnny is an absolute idiot. Ergo, he needs a better representative and actual checks and balances in this sense. So what this means is that we vote for representatives who no more have the time to do so in such a better way. They have checks and balances. One of the beauties of living in America is that we have all of the ways in which one branch of the government can hold another branch of the government in check. And when you look at it, we have found in the last several years that our judicial branch of the government has been God's saving grace given to us because people voted in the past to have good representatives for the present that have given us good superior court justices in this country. No, Supreme Court justices in this country. So the point is that we have a moral duty to participate because God has called us to be citizens of both heaven and earth. Or as Wayne Grudem says it, and I'll just quote him here, I'm not going to put it up there. He says this: I believe that every Christian citizen who lives in a democracy has at the very least a minimal obligation to be well informed and to vote for candidates and policies that are most consistent with biblical principles. The opportunity to help select the kind of government we will have is a stewardship that God entrusts to citizens in a democracy, a stewardship we should not neglect or fail to appreciate. This at least means that Christians are responsible to learn enough about the important issues to be able to vote intelligently, end quote. So my point is this: we need to remember that we here in America, we are not asking our president to be our pastor, and you will never find the quote perfect candidate. You have to vote for the one which most closely aligns with your principles. And that's the beauty of it. That's letting the people speak on an issue. And you know what? There's just this old reality of this, and I almost use it back into this this issue of a sporting analogy in combative sports. If you do all of the work and you put the time and the effort into doing the work and preparing for the fight at hand, and you walk out there on the mats and you give it your all and you leave everything on the mats, and you know what, you happen to lose and everything's done fair, sometimes just that's the way it is. Train harder and come back. Similarly, if you go out and you do all of your research and you find out about the candidates and you find the ones that most closely align off the principles that you have been taught, maybe from, cradle until you're striving closer to grave, and you go out there and you win, great. And if you go out there and you lose, guess what? It happens. God has not somehow fallen off of his sovereign place in society in this regard. Now, sometimes, like I've said, we can get into this, when God brings up a ruler, sometimes it's for good, significant blessing. And you know what? Sometimes we lose because God brings judgment on society. But nonetheless, you need to vote because you need to participate in order to steward the things rightly that God has given you. Now, one of the other things is that I want to say this: Christians should know the issues and vote accordingly. No one denies that. That said, Christians have the moral responsibility, and I'm just going to say this, and this is going to be me endorsing somebody on this. I think Christians, given our particular context, should vote for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. Donald Trump and all of his flaws versus Kamala Harris with all of the even worse flaws that are out there. And here's what I mean by this. When you take all of the key issues out there, I'm not saying Donald Trump is this wonderful saint. I have criticized Trump. I have said things that I disagree with Trump. I'm not going to go out there and just follow the words of Trump on every single thing. There's only one person that I follow in that regard, God himself. That said, there are very clear and key issues that we are running into in the United States right now, in which a Christian cannot support. For example, I am of the conviction that a Christian cannot support the current and present Democratic Party. Why? They are the party of death. They are the party that is attacking religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of government in this sense, which is an attack on the people of the United States and our ability to participate in that particular government. I think that we as Christians, when it comes to the key issues of pro-life, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the issues of how we can participate in this society, it's really like the old farmer said, who's undecided on this? There's no gray on these particular issues. It's very clear. I can say that and say, you know what? Trump's not my pastor, but you know what? Out of the two candidates, he's not just a little bit better. He's exceedingly far better than the alternative of Kamala Harris. For example, take the pro-life issue. Christians should be pro-life without question. Now, we recognize that, yes, there can be issues that happen within pregnancy, but to abort a child is not just a woman's choice. It's a woman's choice to do what? It is to take the innocent life of a child. And I will tell you this, as somebody who has participated at abortion clinics by talking to people and even doing open air preaching at these things, these women are not victims. The first time I ever went to one, somebody came up, this is a little book holder thing, and they held in their hands a butcher knife that went all the way down to their elbow and slammed it up to the window right there as they drove by. I know what that means. That is a pure threat upon somebody. These people are not victims. They're cold-hearted killers in virtually every sense of the term. And what we have found is that historically, the Republicans have tried to run as either the consistent pro-life position or sort of candidates in that regard, or one would hope that they would be the consistent pro-life candidates. But what we found is that unfortunately, they've been chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. And that's sort of putting it nicely. We recognize there's a whole bunch of rhinos out there who have no desire to actually be consistently pro-life. Nobody is denying this. Now, the new Republican Party that we're finding And on the other hand, basically has turned into the Democratic Party of 50 years ago. You know, they want abortions to be safe, legal, and rare. Well, Republicans, what we're finding when they're doing this, they're utterly abandoning their base. And every strong pro-lifer out there, specifically Christian pro-lifers out there, have been speaking out against this. And this is not only an abandonment of their base, it's an abandonment of God-given morality. So I'm not trying to make the Republican Party or Trump or Vivek or any of these guys on this whole abortion issue, JD Vance, all of them giving all these nuances that we were fully against even just a number of years ago. I'm not trying to make these guys out to be saints on this issue. We realize this. But one thing that I want you to see is that in this election, I think a vote for Trump and the Republicans, even with all of their flaws, is going to be a much easier government for pro-lifers to work within than the current Democratic Party that we find ourselves in. The Democratic Party of today, in no short order, is the party of death. They want death basically from cradle to grave on so many issues. They want abortion to be available to anyone, anywhere, for basically any reason. This is an assault before God, who is the author of life, and an assault on the integrity of life in another fellow man. I mean, just think about it. We've all seen the clips. They want abortion at all these different stages, even right up to the moment of death. And even the former governor of Virginia was very clear that if this child goes through an abortion, he survives, we're not going to give it medical care. That is infanticide. Not only abortion, it's infanticide, but it is the clear murder of an innocent person in that regard. My point is this. What I want you to realize is that Democrats aren't just in favor of abortion. They're in favor of infanticide. They're in favor of euthanasia, which for those of you who aren't always up on these things, this is not just small children in China. Euthanasia is the active taking of an innocent life near the end of a person's life. They're like, think of it as taking the food, feeders out of an individual, popping the air out of an individual in that regard. It's the act of taking of a person's life in that regard. Democrats are in favor of virtually all of these kinds of things. And I say virtually because you'd have to talk to them to see how far they're actually going to go. So my point is this. I would rather work with the Republican Party, given all of their flaws, because I think we'll have a much stronger voice in that room going forward than sitting down with the Democrat Party being screamed at every step along the way until you are shouted out of the room. Now, the other issue, something that people kind of talk about, but yet it's been pushed aside, sort of like the Supreme Court has dealt with it. Let's move on. And this is the whole issue of marriage. What do we as Christians do with this whole institution of marriage? And I've said for many, many years, because I was one of the individuals who helped lobby for the North Carolina marriage amendment. I spoke in more places, in more churches, and in front of more people on that than I probably have on anything in my entire life. It utterly consumed me. And what I want you to realize is that many of the states in the United States had very clear bans against this. And the federal government just frankly overturned the will of the people in this regard. It's an utter compromise of the sanctity of marriage within the United States. And to be honest on this, I think both parties are utterly corrupted on this. And I think one of the biggest and greatest moral harms that has ever been done to society has been so-called gay marriage. And from a public policy standpoint, it utterly reshaped the face of normal and acceptable relationships in our nation. So many states, like we said, already had a ban on it because it was viewed as a disservice to society, and it didn't provide the best and proper atmosphere for the nurture and admonition of children. So when it comes to this issue, I honestly just look at this and say, we as Christians need to have a united voice on this from the place of the church. It might be a small voice, but it needs to be a strong voice. And again, I think during this particular time, we're going to have a greater voice within the Republican Party. We're going to have no voice within the Democrat Party. I mean, frankly, when they can't even say what a man or a woman is, you think that they're really going to say that marriage exists as the union between one man and one woman? Because here's what I want you to realize, which is really interesting on all this, is that when you look at this idea of marriage exists as the union between one man and one woman. Notice what they tried to do. They initially started to redefine it in this regard. Well, does it really have to be just between one man and one woman? Why can't it be between one man and another man, or one man and another woman? And I said this, when you take that proposition and you start to massage one of the words in there, well, why can't you not start massaging other words within that definition? So you massage the word or erase the word man and woman, and you put man and man. Well, why not marriage exists as the union between just one man and one woman? Why not one man and multiple women? You know, that's a real conversation that people are having today. Why not have polygamy? Who's to say if you fudge with one end of the definition, you can't fudge with other ends of the definition? Or who's to say something like this? Marriage exists as a union between one man and one woman, and a man was somebody who was defined, or a woman was somebody who was defined before the eyes of the courts, we'll say generically, as somebody who was 18 and above. So, you know, if you're going to get married, you got to wait till you're 18, kid. Sorry, get over it. Well, why, if we can change the word man and woman to mean something else and one to mean something else, why can't we start changing the age restrictions on marriage? Ever thought about that? Do you really want to live in a society in which you have 40-year-old men marrying 13-year-old girls? I don't. So my point is this: we need to really fight the battle for marriage again, because it's all intimately connected. Now, I want to transition to another thing here for why I still think a vote for Trump is superior to a vote for Kamala Harris on the issues of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. There's no other way to put it. There's no other way to understand this. Republicans will maintain your constitutional rights to the freedom of religion and for the freedom of speech because they still believe in the concept of constitutional rights, even as they're applied to these very issues. What's really interesting is that the Democrat Party, with their relativism and their subjectivism and their idea of no real concept of morality, and it's all sociologically connected and contrived and all the rest, they don't have any concept of absolute rights in that regard. They think that rights are something that are given to you by the government, so therefore the government gives them to you. The government can somehow take them away from you. And that's what I want you to realize, is that Democrats aren't going to respect your freedom of religion or your constitutional rights or your freedom of speech and that as some type of constitutional rights, because they don't believe in the concept of rights. They don't believe in the idea of constitutional rights, and they believe in this concept of government gives it to you, so therefore government can take it away from you. It's just as simple as somebody saying, maybe for a while. Well, who's to say we can't change that? And what I want you to realize is that the Democrats of today want to do away with the freedom of religion. So if you're a Christian asking yourself, should I vote in 2024? Well, my whole point is this, is that you should vote in 2024 because, frankly, you may not be able to vote in an election beyond 2024 if these Marxists get their way with what they want to do with the government and society at large. You know, what I want you to see is this, is that these Democrats of today, they see and view Christianity in particular as a threat to their Marxist vision for society. But no, they're really in the horns of a dilemma. They want Marxism more than almost anything you will ever imagine. And Marxism for these people, it operates almost like this lazy Susan in this regard. You know, they want Marxism and they use any tactic they can or event to get to it. So BLM, environmentalism, Palestine and Israel, whatever the issue may be, they don't really care about the issue. all they really care about is Marxism. So here's the horns of the dilemma. They don't like the freedom of religion because, frankly, classic, traditional, biblical, evangelical Christianity is fundamentally at odds with anything Marxist. So they don't want the freedom of religion, and they want to replace it with Marxism. But in doing so, they're actually just substituting one religion for another. You ever think about that? How many times have you been told Marxism is nothing more than a theory of economics? You've heard that? You know, it's about the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois and the proletariats. It's an issue of class warfare and economic freedom, and it's about liberating the oppressed and all the rest. And what's really interesting is that one author, James Lindsay, has spoken about this as Marxism as religion. And he says it's very clear. It's actually a religion in almost every sense of the term. They have a theory of sin, which is class oppression, and they have a theory of salvation, which is the removal of classes, or the eternal goal, which is their utopian society, which is maybe the full vision of their salvific understanding of society. So what's really interesting is these people want to do away with the freedom of religion, all while shoving another religion down your throat. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for Comrade Kamala and her whole policies of communism. It's very clear what they're doing. If you look at it, these people have simply traded out old, classic, traditional Marxist class warfare for a critical race theory warfare. The new classes, the no longer economically oppressed and liberated, but now it's the capital of the racial capital of the oppressed and those who need to be liberated. We could go on and on and on and on. My point is this: Christians should vote in 2024 because the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech are very much at stake. Now, I want to deal with just a couple other issues, probably the last issue, one that evangelicals have talked about. Some are definitely talking about it. But what about the environmental issues? People are going to say, Donald Trump and those guys, they're going to go out and they're going to kill the planet. We need to preserve the earth and all the rest. I'm just going to cut straight through it with all of this. Again, if it's all about Marxism, we can use environmentalism as the means, goal, and all the rest of achieving the revolution of Marxism. And there's no other way of putting it. We recognize, yes, God has called us to be good stewards of this earth. Like, I'm not all out there getting my friends together for, burning tires in my backyard or throwing feces in my water. That is a far cry from what these true environmentalists are all about. There's no other way of putting it. Environmentalism is a made-up farce in order to allow for government control. That's why I call it a form of Marxism. The whole issue of the Earth's resources, energy uses, global warming, and carbon fuels are a scare tactic in order to enact one key policy issue. And you go, what is that one key policy issue? Cap and trade, my friends. Cap and trade. Your business can only do so much productivity, because if you go above that, guess what? Cap and trade comes in and says, you know what? You either need to get some more from somebody else, or you need to stop the means of production in order for us to achieve our environmental goals. And you wonder why there's all these things about every sphere of society about having proper environmental sustainability goals. Not only is it just an issue of the World Economic Forum, but it's a key and vibrant issue of cap and trade and government control. That's why I've gone on to say this. People need to see environmentalism for what it really is. When they're talking about this, and by they, I mean the Democrat Party, you need to see politically, it is a means to enact government control over all areas of your life, period. It's not an issue of we need to love God's planet. That is a massive Mott and Bailey. What they try to do is they try to sound really nice, and they try to sound really caring and say we're here to steward God's creation, when all the while politically they want control. And religiously, you got to view it as this: it is a rival religion in which we function more like, when we do these things, like the pagan earth religions of the past, not a Christian understanding how God is the creator and sustainer of our world and what that truly means. And you know what? We could go on and we could look at other issues of economic policies. It's either capitalism or Marxism, my friends. You can look at issues of freedom of speech and media bias. It's either you have the ability to speak freely and have truth and to speak truth and to understand truth, or you're going to have it filtered. You're going to have people coming around you saying you can't say this and you can't say that and you can't go here and you can't go there and you can't put up videos like this and you can't put videos up like that. It's very clear. So here's what I want you to realize. We need to vote in 2024. Why? Because we have the moral responsibility to do so as citizens of this country and citizens of the kingdom of man on this earth in that regard. And how do we do it? We got to put principles over party. Believe me, I'm not just this Republican purist. I recognize significant errors within it, but I also realize and I recognize the situation that we find ourselves in. One's going to give me religious freedom. Another one is not. The other one's going to give me freedom of speech, and one is not. One is going to be more favorable to the pro-life position. The other is not. One's going to at least allow me to show up and have a traditional understanding of marriage, and I can keep fighting for that. The other one is not. It's very clear. I think that the battle lines are very clear. And going back to that old Iowa farmer, I have not met any of these undecided. So if you're a Christian who's saying, I'm just going to sit this one out, don't. Please vote. Please vote for this one. Vote in the right way. Vote principles over party on this. Put your faith into action in this regard. Recognize that we have a place at the table through the democratic process. Do not neglect it. Now is not the time. Again, thank you.